Our job for the day is to make an educated judgment of Christopher Columbus. How should history remember him? Was he a hero or a villain? Was the overall effect of his actions more positive or more negative for humanity? To make this judgment, we're going to be reading one of the most interesting sources that I assign to 10th graders, normally for homework. In this case, I'll read it to you. And as we go through it, here are kind of the bigger picture, more complex questions to keep in mind. Keeping him in historical context, was he any different from the norm in Europe? Does society shape a person, or are there universal standards of behavior that everyone can be expected to adhere to? In other words, was he a product of the society that he grew up in, or was he just a bad person? Do we judge him by his personal actions, like things he himself did directly, or by the standards he set that other people followed? Or by the long-term effects of his actions? Third, do benefits to us now outweigh the bad things that happened to people back then, in the past? That's like a general question that's usually applicable for things that we study in this class. And then the big question, why does it matter how people remember Christopher Columbus anyway? Beyond that, broader moral questions that we can play with through this exercise. To what extent is violence acceptable in society? To what extent is violence in the name of progress acceptable? How much progress has to occur in order to justify violence in the past? Can ideology justify violence? Is it okay for a few people to suffer for the majority to live better? Is life more important than quality of life? Big questions I look forward to your wrestling with. In my normal class packets, the following is one of the options for source C, an article on Christopher Columbus. And in this article, we'll discuss Columbus's actions in the New World and their effects on the native populations. This is a big kid history article, right? It's complicated. And so you don't need to keep every single detail in mind, but focus on the following guiding questions as we go through. What did Columbus himself actually do? Should we be more impressed with his daring in his voyage, or should we focus on what he actually did once he got to the New World, to the Americas? Should he be judged only by his actions, or is he also responsible for the long-term effects of his actions? In the following video, pause the video if you're doing this as part of my class like now, and answer the questions that appear in red banners. This is going to help you think through what is otherwise a pretty complicated article, and it's important to take some time and think about stuff in chunks before moving on to the next chunk. That's just good reading practice generally. If you need to, pause the video and look up new words or send me a question via chat. The text of the article is on the slides, so you should be able to follow along as I read. Third, this is a high-level article. I don't expect everybody to understand everything in it. In fact, that would be kind of a shock. Instead, try to take what you can from this article without the pressure to understand and remember every little thing. If this is a new sort of thing for you, focus on descriptions, like what happened. If you feel like you have a handle of that, focus on why and how we know and why it matters. And the goal in all of this is for you to form an educated opinion about Columbus as a person. How do you evaluate his actions and why? Now, the article I'm about to read to you comes from a fantastic book called A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which is available in its entirety online on a website called History as a Weapon. And I'm going to be reading you selections from chapter 1. I shortened it a lot for my 10th grade audience. And this version has been pretty effective over the last 8 years that I've taught this topic. So in this article, you will hear about Columbus's actions in the New World and their effects on the native populations, and that's really where you want to focus most of your attention. Remember, our guiding questions. What did he do? Should we be impressed with his daring in his voyage or his actions in his New World? Should that be what we judge him by? And should we judge him only on his actions? Or is he also responsible for the long-term effects of his actions? I broke this article down into sections as well to kind of focus our attention topic by topic. So again, it's expected that you pause the video and think about what you've just heard and ask questions as you need to, and I fully expect that you will need to. In the following, I'm going to read the text. The text is printed on the slide, and if I need to comment or explain things, I'm also going to do that too. So the first section is about the encounter, the very first revolutionary encounter between Christopher Columbus and his crew and the Arawak Indians, the natives who were on the Bahama Islands at the time. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. He later wrote of this in his log. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms, like weapons, and do not know them. For I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of their ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. These Arawaks of the Bahama Islands were much like Indians on the mainland, who were remarkable. European observers would say again and again, for their hospitality, their belief in sharing. These traits did not stand out in the Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, so Catholicism, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus. Columbus wrote, "As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force, in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts." The information that Columbus wanted most was, where is the gold? He had persuaded the King and Queen of Spain to finance an expedition to the lands. The wealth he expected would be on the other side of the Atlantic. The Indies and Asia, gold and spices. For, like other informed people of his time, he knew the world was round, and he could sail west in order to get to the Far East. So, in other words, he'd promised the King and Queen of Spain that he was going to find a ton of gold in the Indian Ocean trade route network. And lots of people knew that the world was round. This was not Columbus's invention, as is commonly thought. Okay, back to the text. Spain was recently unified, one of the new modern nation states, like France, England, and Portugal. Its population, mostly poor peasants, worked for the nobility, who were 2% of the population and owned 95% of the land. Spain had tied itself to the Catholic Church, expelled all the Jews, driven out the Moors, or Muslims. Like other states of the modern world, Spain sought gold, which was becoming the new mark of wealth, more useful than land, because it could buy anything. There was gold in Asia, it was thought, and certainly silks and spices, for Marco Polo and others had brought back marvelous things from their overland expeditions centuries before. Now that the Muslim Turks had conquered Constantinople in the eastern Mediterranean and controlled the land routes to Asia, a sea route was needed. Portuguese sailors were working their way around the southern tip of Africa. Spain decided to gamble on a long sail across an unknown ocean. In return for bringing back gold and spices, they promised Columbus 10% of the profits, governorship over newfound lands, and the fame that would go with the new title, Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was a merchant's clerk from the Italian city of Genoa, part-time weaver, the son of a skilled weaver, and expert sailor. He set out with 3 sailing ships, the largest of which was the Santa Maria, perhaps 100 feet long, and 39 crew members. Columbus would never have made it to Asia, which was thousands of miles farther away than he had calculated, imagining a smaller world. He would have been doomed by the great expanse of the sea, but he was lucky. 1/4 of the way he came upon an unknown, uncharted land that lay between Europe and Asia, the Americas. It was early October 1492, and 33 days since he and his crew had left the Canary Islands off the Atlantic coast of Africa. Now they saw branches and sticks floating in the water. They saw flocks of birds. These were signs of land. Then, on October 12th, a sailor called Rodrigo saw the early morning moon shining on white sands and cried out. It was an island in the Bahamas, the Caribbean Sea. The first man to sight land was supposed to get a yearly pension of 10,000 maravedis for life, but Rodrigo never got it. Columbus claimed he had seen light the evening before. He got the reward. So, approaching land, they were met by the Arawak Indians, who swam out to greet them. The Arawaks lived in village communes, had a developed agriculture of corn, yams, cassava. They could spin and weave, but they had no horses or work animals. They had no iron, but they wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears. This was to have enormous consequences. It led Columbus to take some of them aboard ship as prisoner because he insisted they guide him to the source of the gold. He then sailed to what is now Cuba, then to Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, bits of visible gold in the rivers and a gold mask presented to Columbus by a local Indian chief led to wild visions of gold fields. On Hispaniola, out of timbers from the Santa Maria, which had run aground, Columbus built a fort, the first European military base here in the Western Hemisphere. He called it Navidad and left 39 crew members there with instructions to find and store the gold. He took more Indian prisoners and put them aboard his 2 remaining ships. At one part of the island, he got into a fight with the Indians who refused to trade as many bows and arrows as he and his men wanted. 2 were run through with swords and bled to death. Then the Nina and the Pinta set sail for the Azores in Spain. When the weather turned cold, the Indian prisoners began to die. Columbus's report to the court in Madrid was extravagant. He insisted he had reached Asia. It was Cuba, and an island off the coast of China, which was actually Hispaniola. His descriptions were part fact, part fiction. Hispaniola is a miracle. Mountains and hills, plains and pastures are both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers of which the majority contain gold. There are many spices and great mines of gold and other metals. The Indians, Columbus reported, are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. He concluded by asking for a little help from their majesties, and in return he would bring them from his next voyage as much gold as they needed, and as many slaves as they asked. He was full of religious talk. Thus the eternal God, our Lord, gives victory to those who follow his way over apparent impossibilities. Because of Columbus's exaggerated reports and promises, his second expedition was given 17 ships and more than 1,200 men. The aim was clear: slaves and gold. They went from island to island in the Caribbean, taking Indians as captive. But as word spread of the Europeans' intent, they found more and more empty villages. On Haiti, they found that the sailors left behind at Fort Navidad had been killed in a battle with the Indians after they had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves for sex and labor. Now, from his base in Haiti, Columbus sent expedition after expedition to the interior. They found no gold fields, but had to fill up the ships returning to Spain with some kind of dividend. In the year 1495, they went on a great slave raid, rounded up 1,500 Arawak men, women, and children, put them in pens guarded by Spaniards and dogs. then picked the 500 best specimens to load onto ships. Of those 500, 200 died en route. The rest arrived alive in Spain and were put up for sale by the archdeacon of the town, who reported that, although the slaves were naked as the day they were born, they showed no more embarrassment than animals. Columbus later wrote, "Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." But too many of the slaves died in captivity. So Columbus, desperate to pay back dividends to those who had invested, had to make good his promise to fill the ships with gold. In Haiti, where he and his men imagined huge gold fields to exist, they ordered all persons 14 years or older to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. When they brought it, they were given copper tokens to hang around their necks. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off and bled to death. The Indians had been given an impossible task. The only gold around was bits of dust garnered from the streams, so they fled, were hunted down with dogs, and were killed. Trying to put together an army of resistance, the Arawaks faced Spaniards who had armor, muskets, so guns, swords, horses. When the Spaniards took prisons, they hanged them or burned them to death. Among the Arawaks, mass suicides began with cassava poison. Infants were killed to save them from the Spaniards. In 2 years, through murder, mutilation, or suicide, half of the 250,000 Indians in Haiti were dead. When it became clear that there was no gold left, the Indians were taken as slave labor on huge estates, known later as encomiendas. They were worked at a ferocious pace and died by the thousands. By the year 1515, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500. A report of the year 1650 shows that none of the original Arawaks or their descendants were left on the island. The chief source of information about what happened on the islands after Columbus came is Bartolomé de las Casas, who, as a young priest, participated in the conquest of Cuba. For a time he owned a plantation on which Indian slaves worked, but he gave that up and became a vehement critic of Spanish cruelty. Las Casas transcribed Columbus's journal and, in his 50s, began a multi-volume history of the Indies. In it, he described the Indians. They are agile, he says, and can swim long distances, especially the women. They are not completely peaceful, because they do battle from time to time with other tribes, but their casualties seem small, and they fight when they are individually moved to do so because of some grievance, not on the orders of captains or kings. Women in Indian society were treated so well as to startle the Spaniards. Las Casas describes sex relations. Marriage laws are non-existent. Men and women alike choose their mates. They multiply in great abundance. Pregnant women work to the last minute and give birth almost painlessly. Up the next day, they bathe in the river and are as clean and healthy as before giving birth. On the whole, Indian men and women look upon total nakedness with as much casualness as we look upon a man's head or at his hands. The Indians, Las Casas says, have no religion, at least no temples. They live in large communal bell-shaped buildings, housing up to 600 people at one time, made of very strong wood, and roofed with palm trees. They prize bird feathers, beads, and green and white stones with which they adorn their ears and lips, but they put no value on gold or other precious things. They lack all manner of commerce, neither buying nor selling, and rely exclusively on their natural environment for maintenance. They are extremely generous with their possessions, and by the same token, expect the same degree of liberality. In Book 2 of his History of the Indies, Las Casas, who at first urged replacing Indians by black slaves, thinking they were stronger and would survive, but later relented when he saw the effects on blacks, tells about the treatment of the Indians by the Spaniards. It is a unique account and deserves to be quoted at length. Endless testimonies prove the mild and pacific temperament of the natives, but our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder, then, if they tried to kill one of us now and then. The admiral, it is true, was blind as those who came after him, and he was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians. Las Casas tells how the Spaniards grew more conceited every day, and after a while refused to walk at any distance. They rode the backs of Indians as if they were in a hurry, or were carried on hammocks by Indians running in relays. In this case, they also had Indians carry large leaves to shade them from the sun, and others to fan them with goose wings. Total control led to total cruelty. The Spaniards thought nothing of knifing Indians by the 10s and 20s and of cutting slices off them to test the sharpness of their blades. Las Casas tells how 2 of these so-called Christians met 2 Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and, for fun, beheaded the boys. The Indians' attempts to defend themselves failed, and when they ran off into the hills, they were found and killed. So, Las Casas reports, they suffered and died in the mines and other labors in desperate silence, knowing not a soul in the world to whom they could turn for help. He describes their work in the mines. Mountains are stripped from top to bottom 1,000 times. They dig, split rocks, move stones, and carry dirts on their backs to wash it in the rivers, while those who wash gold stay in the water at all times, with their backs bent so constantly it breaks them. And when water invades the mines, the most arduous task of all is to dry the mines out by scooping up pans full of water and throwing it up outside. After each 6 or 8 months' work in the mines, which was the time required of each crew to dig enough gold for the melting, up to 1/3 of the men died. While the men were sent many miles away to the mines, the wives remained to work the soil, forced into excruciating job of digging and making thousands of hills for cassava plants. Husbands and wives were together only once every 8 to 10 months, and when they met, they were so exhausted and depressed, they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them, and for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation. Husbands died in the mines, women died at work, and children died from lack of milk. And in a short time, this land, which was so great, so powerful, and so fertile, was depopulated. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write. When he arrived on Hispaniola in 1508, Las Casas says, there were 60,000 people living on this island, including the Indians, so that from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. Section 2. Why does it matter how we remember Columbus? For the record, I'm recording this video in January of 2021. It has not yet been a year since multiple protests in the United States and worldwide, specifically over this issue, erupted. So back to Howard Zinn's book. Thus began the history, 500 years ago, of the European invasion of the Indian settlements in the Americas. That beginning, when you read Las Casas, even if his figures are exaggerations, were there 3 million Indians to begin with, as he says, or less than 1 million, as some other historians have calculated, or 8 million, as others now believe? Even if his figures are exaggerations, that beginning is conquest, slavery, death. When we read the history books given to children in the United States, it all starts with a heroic adventure. There is no bloodshed, and Columbus Day is a celebration. Past the elementary and high schools, there are only occasional hints of something else. Samuel Elliott Morrison, the Harvard historian, was the most distinguished writer on Columbus, and was himself a sailor who retraced Columbus's route across the Atlantic. In his popular book, Christopher Columbus, Mariner, written in 1954, he tells about the enslavement and the killing. Quote, the cruel policy initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors, so the people who came after him, resulted in complete genocide. That is on one page, buried halfway into the telling of a grand romance. In the book's last paragraph, Morrison sums up his view of Columbus. He had his faults and his defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great: his indomitable will, his superb faith in God, and in his own mission as the Christ-bearer to lands beyond the seas, his stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. But there was no flaw, no dark side to the most outstanding and essential of all his qualities: his seamanship. Now, one can lie outright about the past, or one can omit facts, so leave facts out, that might lead to unacceptable conclusions. And Morrison does neither. He refuses to lie about Columbus. He does not omit the story of mass murder. Indeed, he describes it with the harshest word one can use: genocide. But he does something else. He mentions the truth quickly and goes on to other things that are more important to him. Outright lying or quiet omission takes the risk of discovery, which, when made, might arouse the reader to rebel against the writer. To state the facts, however, and then to bury them in a mass of other information, is to say to the reader with a certain infectious calm, yeah, mass murder took place, but it's not that important. It should weigh very little in our final judgments. It should affect very little what we do in the world. It's not that the historian can avoid emphasis of some facts and not of others. This is as natural to him as to the mapmaker who, in order to produce a usable drawing, must first flatten and distort the shape of the earth, then choose out of the bewildering mass of geographic information those things needed for the purpose of this or that particular map. My argument cannot be against selection, simplification, emphasis, which are inevitable for historians. But the mapmaker's distortion is a technical necessity for a common purpose shared by all people who need maps. The historian's distortion is more than technical. It is ideological. It is released into a world of contending interests, where any chosen emphasis supports, whether the historian means to or not, some kind of interest, whether economic or political or racial or national or sexual. Furthermore, this ideological interest is not openly expressed. No, it is presented as if all readers of history have a common interest, which historians serve to the best of their ability. This is not intentional deception. The historian has been trained in a society in which education and knowledge are put forward as technical problems of excellence and not as tools for contending social classes, races, or nations. So in other words, he's saying that when making a narrative, all historians have to choose which facts to emphasize. They choose which parts of the story to tell. But that's not an innocent choice, and those choices reveal something about who that historian is serving, which part of the power structure that historian is working for. To emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de-emphasize their genocide is not a technical necessity, but an ideological choice. It serves, unwittingly, to justify what was done. My point is not that we must, in telling history, accuse, judge, or condemn Columbus in absentia, so in his absence. It's too late for that. It would be a useless scholarly exercise in morality. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress, like Hiroshima and Vietnam to save Western civilization, Kronstadt and Hungary to save socialism, nuclear proliferation to save us all, that is still with us. One reason these atrocities are still with us is that we have learned to bury them in a mass of other facts, as radioactive wastes are buried in containers in the earth. We have learned to give them exactly the same proportion of attention that teachers and writers often give them in the most respectable of classrooms and textbooks. This learned sense of moral proportion, coming from the apparent objectivity of the scholar, is accepted more easily than when it comes from politicians at press conferences. It is therefore more deadly. So what he's saying is, when we skip over the violent parts of history, the human cost of it, and jump straight into effects that are good, progress, the story of evolution of humanity, we're really saying that the violence is okay. And we're saying that in a context where it seems normal, objective, where it seems like the person telling that story has nothing to gain. And that's what makes it dangerous, is what he's saying. The treatment of heroes, Columbus, and their victims, the Arawaks, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress, is only one aspect of a certain approach to history, in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, leaders. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance, as if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, it's as if they represent the nation as a whole. The pretense is that there really is such a thing as the United States, subject to occasional conflicts and quarrels, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests. It is as if there really is a national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansion, in the laws passed by Congress, the decisions of the courts, the development of capitalism, the culture of education, and the mass media. History is the memory of states, wrote Henry Kissinger in his first book, A World Restored, in which he proceeded to tell the history of 19th century Europe from the viewpoint of the leaders of Austria and England, ignoring the millions who suffered from those statesmen policies. From his standpoint, the peace that Europe had before the French Revolution was restored by the diplomacy of a few national leaders. But for factory workers in England, farmers in France, colored people in Asia and Africa, women and children everywhere except in the upper classes, it was a world of conquest, violence, hunger, exploitation, a world not restored, but disintegrated. My viewpoint is different. We must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the job of thinking people not to be on the side of the executioners. Thus, in that inevitable taking of sides which comes from the selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to tell the story of the discovery of the Americas from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, to tell the story of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves, to tell the story of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokee Indians, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young men and women in the textile mills, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the First World War as seen by the socialists, the Second World War as seen by the pacifists, the New Deal as seen by blacks in Harlem, the post-war American Empire as seen by peons in Latin America, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of others. In other words, the history that we're usually told is usually the history that falls under the interests of the most powerful people in the country. It tells their story and ignores all of the people at the bottom. And Zinn is saying that he prefers to see history from the other side, from the people who tend to get crushed by most tellings of history. My point is not to grieve for the victims and denounce the executioners. Those tears, that anger, cast into the past, deplete our moral energy for the present. And the lines are not always clear. In the long run, the oppressor is also a victim. In the short run, and so far human history has consisted only of short runs, the victims themselves, desperate and tainted with the culture that oppresses them, turn on other victims. Still, understanding these complexities, I will be skeptical of governments and their attempts through politics and culture to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood pretending to a common interest. I will try not to overlook the cruelties that victims inflict on one another as they are jammed together in the boxcars of the system. I don't want to romanticize them, but I do remember a statement I once read. The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is. To think that history writing must aim simply to recapitulate the failures that dominate the past is to make historians collaborators in an endless cycle of defeat. If history is to be creative, to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, occasionally to win. I am supposing, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past's fugitive moments of compassion rather than its solid centuries of warfare. That, being as blunt as I can, is my approach to the history of the United States.